The moment I stepped into the reintegration evaluation hall at Fort Carson, I felt the air tighten around my chest as if the entire room sighed before I even took my seat. There were about 60 people inside, a mix of soldiers in green service uniforms, commanders in neat rows, medical officers with clipboards, and behavioral health evaluators who looked like they had already heard too many stories like mine. The long fluorescent lights hummed above us, casting a pale glow over the auditorium. Flags lined the back wall. A podium stood centered under the emblem of the United States Army. It should have been a day of closure, or at least the beginning of something steadier. I had spent months in therapy, months trying to breathe, months trying to convince myself that coming here did not make me weak. Reintegration is not supposed to be a trial. It is supposed to be a place where soldiers like me are guided back into the rhythm of service. That is what I told myself over and over. Then my parents walked in. They never looked comfortable on a military installation. My mother, Linda, wore a stiff navy blouse, as if dressing up made her look supportive. My father, Robert, walked with that familiar, impatient stride, hands in pockets face sharp. My brother, Ethan, trailed behind them, chewing gum board before anything even began. I tried not to look at them, but I felt the weight of their eyes before I even sat down. When the behavioral health officer called my name, I took a seat in the first row of interview chairs back straight, palms pressed against my knees. My name tag read, Captain Avery Dalton. My heart pounded harder than it ever had in the field. It is strange how a uniform can make you feel powerful in some places and exposed in others. I heard my mother whisper first, but her whisper was not quiet. PTSD. She said it with a laugh tucked inside the word. She is just dramatic. She always wanted attention. The sentence rolled across the room like a dropped tray in a silent cafeteria. Heads turned. A few soldiers blinked as if they were not sure they heard correctly. Two nurses exchanged a glance that was half disbelief and half pity. My father shrugged as if someone had asked him what the weather was. He added under his breath, but loud enough for several people nearby to hear, "She is just sensitive. Always was. Always will be." My cheeks burned. My hands shook. I could feel the edges of a flashback pulling at me the memory of a blast of heat in Syria, a moment where I was not sure if I was still alive. I blinked fast to stay in the present. My throat tightened. It felt as if the humiliation gathered around my feet and climbed higher with each second. Soldiers younger than me, privates and specialists who had never left the country, stared at me with wide, uncertain eyes. In that moment, I was not a captain. I was a daughter being belittled by the two people who should have understood the cost of my service. My breathing slowed into something sharp and shallow. I heard someone behind me mutter, "That is messed up." Major White stopped flipping through his clipboard. His jaw tightened. He looked genuinely stunned. I swallowed hard. The auditorium was no longer just a room. It felt like a stage where I had been shoved into the spotlight without a script. My parents laughed again. Not loud, but with a puff of breath that said more than any words. That was when I heard the shift. A firm, heavy sound. A folder slammed shut. The noise cracked through the auditorium like a command. Every head turned toward the back right corner. Colonel Marcus Hayes rose from his seat. He moved slowly, but with a deliberate tension that pulled the entire room into silence. I had seen his name on paperwork, but never met him in person. Tall, silver hair, shoulders that carried decades of service, a presence that demanded respect without asking for it. He stepped forward once. Then again, the sound of his boots echoed against the floor. He did not look at me. He looked straight at my parents. His voice cut through the air. "Sit down. Now." It was not shouted. It was not angry. It was the kind of tone that made even seasoned officers freeze. My parents stiffened. My mother's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. My father straightened as if he had been pulled upright by a rope. Colonel Hayes held their gaze for a long, controlled moment. A moment that told everyone in that room something had snapped in the air. Something had shifted. Before I tell you what Colonel Hayes did, next drop where you are watching from and what time it is. What happened after that changed everything. I thought I knew about myself, about my family, and about what it means when someone finally decides to stand up for you. I grew up in a house where love was handed out by category and merit was measured by something I never seemed to possess. My parents never said they had a favorite, but the truth lived in every decision they made. Ethan, my older brother by 2 years, moved through childhood as if the world had been designed for him. When he turned 16, my father spent an entire Saturday driving him to dealerships until they found a used black Mustang that looked like it belonged in a magazine ad. I remember standing on the curb while the salesman handed Ethan the keys. My father clapped him on the back and said, "There you go, champ." My mother took pictures. No one asked if I wanted a turn behind the wheel. No one wondered what I might need when my own 16th birthday approached later that year. All I got was a grocery store cake and a reminder that girls did not need cars because girls always had someone to drive them. I started working at Walmart that same summer. I bagged groceries and stocked shelves while Ethan cruised around town showing off his Mustang to girls from school. I did my homework in the break room and saved every check in a shoebox under my bed. My parents did not object. In fact, my mother said I was being practical, which was her polite way of saying she had no intention of helping me with anything. When Ethan applied to college, he submitted one application to the University of Colorado. He got in. My parents celebrated as if he had been accepted into an Ivy League program. My father wrote a check for the first year of tuition. My mother signed paperwork for a new apartment near campus. They toured the building as if choosing a vacation home. When I asked if any of that was left for me, my father said, "College is expensive. Avery, you will need to be realistic." My mother added, "Girls do not need fancy degrees. Find something stable, administrative work, nursing maybe, something that fits your nature." That was my entire college counseling session. I kept working. I saved. I studied on my own because no one checked my grades unless it was to compare them with Ethan's. Whenever Ethan made the dean's list, the family went out to dinner. When I made honor roll, my mother glanced at the paper and said, "Good, keep it up." Ethan never worked a day in high school. I worked every weekend and after school. Even then, my parents trusted him with responsibility and treated me like an accident waiting to happen. When Ethan dented the Mustang by backing into a mailbox, my father calmly called insurance and said, "These things happen." When I overcooked dinner one night while trying to help my mother, she snapped at me as if I had burned the entire house down. I carried all of this quietly. Children do not often realize favoritism while living inside it. They simply adapt to survive. By the time I turned 18, I already felt like the odd piece that never fit the puzzle of my own family. The tipping point came the day I told them I had enlisted. It was spring of my senior year, the kind of Colorado morning when snow melts by noon and the air feels clean. I stood in the kitchen holding the enlistment paperwork with my recruiter's card clipped to the top. My hands trembled. I thought maybe, just maybe, they would be proud. My mother stared at me for several long seconds. Then she laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a dismissive one. "Why would you do that, Avery? You hate the outdoors. You hate physical training. You cannot even run a mile without turning purple." My father shook his head. "Military is not for girls. That is not a career. That is a phase. You should look at community college, something manageable." Ethan, who was pouring cereal at the counter, snorted so hard, milk sprayed from his spoon. He said the line that would follow me for years, "G.I. Barbie." My mother hid a smile behind her hand. My father chuckled. Ethan laughed again and said, "Maybe they will give you a pink helmet." That was the first day I realized my family did not simply underestimate me. They did not see me at all. I folded the papers and walked out of the kitchen with a calm I did not feel. Inside me, something burned. Not rage, not sadness. Something sharper. Determination, maybe. A desire to create distance from the version of myself they kept trying to push me into. When I left for basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, my parents drove me to the bus station. They did not get out of the car. My mother handed me a small envelope with $50 and said, "Do not forget to write." My father said, "Be smart, do not try too hard." Ethan stayed home because he had a date. The bus pulled away, and I remember staring out the window as my hometown shrank behind me. For the first time, I felt the possibility of becoming someone different, someone who was not defined by the low expectations of the people who raised me. Still, the ache of their dismissal followed me. It sat heavy in my chest during those first early mornings when drill sergeants barked commands. It lingered in my thoughts during late nights of field training when exhaustion blurred everything. But that ache also fed something fierce inside me. It pushed me to run faster, to fight harder, and to refuse to quit even when the ground shook under mortar fire years later in places my family would never understand. People often say childhood shapes you. Mine carved me into someone who could stand in a war zone without breaking, yet somehow still tremble in a room where my parents laughed at a wound they could not see. Their favoritism did not stop when I left home. It transformed into something colder, a refusal to accept the woman I was becoming, a refusal to acknowledge the sacrifices I made, a refusal to treat my service with even the smallest respect. And so the stage was set long before the day they mocked my PTSD in a room full of soldiers. Their betrayal had deep roots. I had just never imagined how public their cruelty would become. Fort Leonard Wood greeted me with a heat that settled into the Missouri air like a warning. On the first day of basic training, I stood in formation surrounded by strangers who looked both terrified and determined. I felt something close to relief. No one here knew the version of me my family insisted on. No one called me dramatic. No one laughed at the idea of me wearing a uniform. When the drill sergeants stormed toward us barking orders with a volume that shook the gravel under our boots, I did not flinch. I had already lived 18 years in a house where criticism came quiet and sharp. Yelling felt almost simple. The first weeks were a blur of early mornings, wet boots, aching muscles, and long nights that tested every piece of me. I learned to break down an M4 rifle blindfolded. I learned to run farther than I ever thought I could. I learned to push myself past the point where my lungs begged for mercy. Every time someone else slowed down, I pushed ahead because I had something to prove, not just to the Army, but to the echo of my parents' voices that insisted I was incapable. When I graduated from basic and moved into military police training, I finally felt a sense of direction. MP school demanded discipline, precision, and a type of mental resilience that felt like it belonged to me more than anything I had tried before. I was good at reading people, good at staying calm under pressure, good at stepping into chaos without losing my center. During vehicle inspection drills and law enforcement scenarios, I found that I could think clearly even when alarms blared and instructors shouted. It surprised me at first. It surprised my instructors even more. One of them pulled me aside after a training simulation and told me I had the mindset for the field. That was the first time an adult had ever said something like that to me. When I earned my badge and the right to wear the MP brassard, my parents sent a short message. "Good job, Avery. No call, no pride, no interest." Ethan texted me a single emoji, a thumbs up. I did not expect much more, but a small part of me had hoped they might see what I was becoming. By the time I deployed to Afghanistan in late 2017, I had stopped waiting for their approval. Our unit was stationed near Kandahar. The first night I stepped out of the aircraft, the air was dusty and hot and carried the weight of a place that had seen too much. Convoy patrols became routine faster than I expected. Days blurred together under the harsh Afghan sun. We escorted supply lines, responded to local disturbances, and worked with joint units to secure checkpoints. Some days passed without incident, some did not. The first convoy attack happened on a road we had driven a dozen times. I remember the sudden force of vibration that seemed to lift the entire vehicle, an eruption of sound that swallowed every thought. I was thrown hard against the harness. Someone yelled contact. Dust filled the cabin. When I forced my hands to move, I helped pull another soldier from the rear seat, his forehead bleeding, his eyes wide with shock. Later that night, when the adrenaline faded and the silence of the barracks crept in, I felt something shift inside my chest. A hollow ringing followed me into sleep. I emailed my parents the next morning to let them know I was safe. My mother replied hours later with a single line, "Keep your head down." My father wrote, "Stay focused. No mention of fear. No comfort. No love." Ethan did not reply at all. The months that followed made me harder, more capable, less afraid of the things the desert threw at us. I learned how to scan the horizon for threats, how to assess damage, how to carry the weight of losses that came without warning. When we rotated home in mid-2018, I felt older than 25. I carried the kind of memories you do not talk about with people who have never heard gunfire. Still, I volunteered for another deployment in 2021, this time to Syria. I told myself it was duty. Mostly, it was because the desert felt easier than my parents' living room. Syria was harsher in different ways. Our unit handled route security through narrow corridors that twisted through villages. One morning, during a routine escort, a secondary blast struck the rear vehicle of our convoy. Ammunition rattled. Smoke poured upward in a thick plume. An injured specialist lay pinned under a collapsed section of metal. Instinct carried me. I crawled into the wreckage despite the smoke and heat pulling him out and dragging him toward cover while another soldier provided security. His weight felt heavier than anything I had ever lifted, but I did not stop. When we reached safety, I remember looking down at my hands, shaking violently as medics took over. That night, the hollow ringing returned louder, darker. I woke up drenched in sweat, unsure whether I was in Syria or back home. I pushed the thought away and went back to work. You cannot break in a place like that, or at least you cannot let anyone see it. When I returned stateside in late 2021, the cracks were harder to hide. Loud noises made my pulse spike. Crowded spaces felt dangerous. Sleep came in fragments. VA doctors diagnosed me with moderate PTSD after several appointments. They were calm, patient, understanding. My family was none of these things. When I told them about the diagnosis, my mother sighed dramatically as if I had exaggerated a cold. My father said, "You always make things bigger than they are." Ethan laughed over the phone and said, "Maybe stop watching war movies." I hung up before he finished the sentence. They had never seen what I saw. They never would. Their dismissal did not wound me the same way it once had. It did something different. It made me silent. It made me steady. It pushed me toward understanding that the people I once thought I needed could not meet me where I stood. The first signs of PTSD did not make me weak. The lack of support from my own family did, and that wound would follow me all the way into the reintegration evaluation hall where everything they mocked would finally be brought into the light. I came back to Colorado in early 2023 wearing the same uniform that had carried me through deserts and convoys and nights when I was not sure I would live to see the next sunrise. The air in Colorado Springs felt too clean, almost foreign after years overseas. The mountains rose sharp and cold in the distance. People in the airport clapped when they saw uniforms. A little girl handed me a paper flag she had drawn. Strangers thanked me with warm voices. I told myself that home would be the place where everything settled. I was wrong. The first night in my small on-base apartment, I woke up drenched in sweat. I had seen the flash again, the same one from Syria, the split second where the MRAP blew sideways and the world tilted into dust and heat. In the dream, I could not reach the specialist pinned under the wreckage. No matter how many times I clawed through the metal, he slipped further away. When I jolted awake, my hands were trembling so badly I had to sit on them to make them still. The nightmares came again the next night and the next. Sometimes I woke to the sound of my own breathing shaking loose. Sometimes I heard explosions that were not there. Sometimes a hallway or a parking garage felt too narrow and I saw shadows where there were none. I tried grounding exercises. I tried long runs. I tried silence. Nothing stopped the creeping sensation that something inside me had come home fractured. The VA appointment came 2 weeks after my return. The building was quiet, its hallways lined with posters reminding us that invisible wounds matter. The clinician listened carefully while I explained the dreams, the anxiety, the sudden panic that hit whenever a door slammed too hard. She asked about memory gaps, concentration issues, moments of disorientation. She nodded often. She never looked surprised. After the evaluation, she sat back and said, "You meet the criteria for moderate PTSD. Moderate, not severe, not mild. The middle ground that can bend you without breaking you." I stared at the diagnosis letter in my car for a long time before driving home. It felt like an admission and a warning at once. I did not tell my parents right away. I should have trusted my instincts and never told them at all. When I finally did, the reaction came fast. My mother wrinkled her face as if I had confessed something embarrassing. "Avery, you have always been dramatic. You make everything into a crisis." My father leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. You have always had a soft constitution. It is probably nothing. Do not rely on labels to avoid responsibility. I tried to explain the evaluations, the flashbacks, the VA process. They talked over me. Ethan walked into the living room halfway through the conversation, picked up his phone, and said, "So now you have a diagnosis. Congratulations, I guess." He did not say it with malice. He said it with boredom, as if my trauma was an inconvenience interrupting his day. When I left their house that night, my chest felt tight. The air outside felt colder than before. I told myself I should not expect anything better, but part of me still wished that someone would have offered even a simple "Are you okay?" A week later, someone sent me a screenshot. Ethan had posted on Facebook. Some people exaggerate Iraq trauma for sympathy. I stared at the words for a long time. I had never even served in Iraq. He had not bothered to get the location right. Hundreds of his friends could see that post, former classmates, neighbors, relatives. I scrolled through the comments. People responded with vague encouragements like, "Stay strong, man, and you know how people are." One comment said, "I always wondered about her." Another said, "If she is not careful, she will ruin her career." I felt my face grow hot. My throat closed. There was something uniquely painful about seeing your service twisted by someone who never risked anything. I sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot where I had stopped to buy dinner. The world felt both too loud and too small. My hands shook, and the steering wheel blurred in front of me. For years, I had worn hardness like armor. For years, I had held myself together through chaos and fear and dust storms that whipped across Syrian roads. I had not cried in a long time, maybe not since Afghanistan. But reading those words, seeing the cheap mockery of what I had endured, something inside me cracked. I cried, not quietly, not with dignity. I cried with the force of everything I had buried for years, the kind of sobbing that comes from a place deeper than logic, deeper than pride. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and let the tears fall until my chest ached. I cried for the soldier I pulled from the wreckage. I cried for the sleepless nights. I cried for the fear that followed me home like a shadow, and for the family who refused to see any of it. When the tears finally subsided, I felt emptied out, hollow. But beneath the hollowness, something else formed. A slow, steady burn. A recognition that the people I had spent my entire life trying to earn affection from were never going to understand me. They never intended to. Their cruelty was not accidental. It was patterned, predictable, deliberate. That night, I sat in the dark parking lot and realized that the next chapter of my life would not be about convincing them to see me. It would be about refusing to let them define me. Their disbelief would follow me into the reintegration evaluation hall months later. Their laughter would push me toward the breaking point. And the moment Colonel Hayes rose from his seat, that slow, steady burn inside me would ignite into something I had never allowed myself to feel before. Resolve. The letter from Fort Carson arrived on a cold morning in February 2024, tucked neatly among grocery flyers and bills I had not opened yet. The envelope carried the familiar Army insignia. My name was printed in precise block letters. For a moment I held it without opening it, feeling the weight of everything that had brought me to this point. The nightmares, the diagnosis, the long sessions at the VA clinic, the silence that followed every interaction with my parents. When I finally tore it open, the message inside was direct. Reintegration evaluation ceremony. Attendance mandatory. Family participation strongly encouraged. It was scheduled for early April. The ceremony, the packet explained, would serve two purposes. First, to review my psychological, physical, and operational readiness after deployment. Second, to acknowledge the sacrifices made during service and allow family members to hear directly from the medical team and command staff. It was meant to restore bridges, meant to give families a deeper understanding of what their soldiers had endured, meant to make home feel more like home. I stared at the words "family participation strongly encouraged" and felt my stomach tighten. I knew exactly what that meant. I would have to invite them. The idea of sitting in a room with my parents while doctors discussed symptoms and triggers and the realities of trauma made my pulse speed up. But attendance was noted in each soldier's file. Refusing to include them would be seen as avoidance. Avoidance could complicate the evaluation. I needed this evaluation to go well. It determined whether I could return fully to duty. I picked up my phone and typed a simple message in the family group chat. I have a reintegration evaluation ceremony at Fort Carson in April. The Army encourages families to attend. Here are the details. My thumb hovered over the send button for a long moment. Then I pressed it. The responses came faster than I expected. My mother replied first. Finally, they will see you are exaggerating, as if the ceremony were some kind of performance review for me to fail. My father followed with a short, "That is fine. We will come." His tone, even through text, carried the same detached authority he had used my entire life. He did not ask how I felt. He did not ask whether I wanted them there. Ethan sent a thumbs-up emoji. No words, no interest. Just a small floating symbol that said everything about how seriously he took this. I put my phone face down on the table. I knew better than to expect support, but the sting landed deeper than I wanted to admit. I walked around my apartment to shake off the tightness in my chest. The space was clean, quiet, predictable. Yet, for the first time since moving in, it felt smaller. Reintegration ceremonies were designed to rebuild trust between soldiers and loved ones. The idea of facing mine in a room full of military personnel who understood trauma while the 3 people who had mocked my diagnosis sat a few feet away made me feel exposed, vulnerable in a way I had never felt in uniform. At my next therapy session at the VA clinic, I told the doctor about the invitation. She asked how I felt about them attending. I told her the truth. It makes my skin crawl. She nodded slowly. Avoidance is common. Fear of dismissal from loved ones is common, but you are not alone in this process. The command team is trained to manage conflict during these evaluations. You will not be thrown to the wolves. Her reassurance helped a little, but not enough. At night, the worry returned. I pictured my mother sitting in that auditorium whispering judgments. I pictured my father leaning back in his chair, unimpressed with everything he heard. I pictured Ethan smirking the way he always did when he thought I was taking life too seriously. My nightmares grew heavier as the date approached. In some dreams, I walked into the evaluation hall only to find the seats filled with smoke. In others, my parents stood on a stage holding microphones calling me weak. I woke each time with a jolt and a racing heartbeat. One afternoon, while sitting in my parked car outside the commissary, I typed a message to my best friend, someone I trusted more than anyone in uniform or out. I told her I was terrified. She wrote back immediately, "Of course you are. Anyone would be. But you have survived worse. And this time, you will not be alone." I read those words twice, maybe 3 times. She was right. What I feared most was not the evaluation itself. It was the humiliation, the possibility that they would belittle my trauma in front of people who truly understood it. The possibility that they would embarrass me in a space where soldiers were encouraged to be honest about the darkest parts of their experiences. It felt like the kind of betrayal that could reopen wounds I had spent months trying to close. I knew soldiers who had strong families cheering them through reintegration. Their parents came with notebooks writing down questions for the behavioral health team. Their spouses brought tissues. Their siblings held their hands. I tried not to envy them. I tried not to wonder why my family could not be even a fraction as supportive. The days leading up to the ceremony moved too quickly. I prepared my uniform, polished my shoes, rehearsed what the evaluators might ask, memorized breathing techniques my therapist had taught me. Still, the worry lingered. One night, unable to sleep, I sat on the edge of my bed and whispered the question out loud. Why am I doing this? The answer came slowly but clearly. Because this evaluation was not for them. It was for me. It was for the soldier who dragged a wounded specialist out of burning metal. It was for the woman who survived Syria even when her own family refused to acknowledge what that meant. Before the ceremony arrived, I filmed a short message on my phone to use later in the video version of this story. Have you ever been dismissed by your own family? Hit like if yes. I pressed record off and stared at my reflection. I thought about how many people had felt exactly what I felt in that moment. Alone, unseen, unbelieved. The ceremony was coming, and none of us knew what was waiting on the other side. The night before the reintegration evaluation felt longer than anything I had lived through overseas. I tried to follow the routine my therapist recommended: warm shower, breathing exercise, a short walk to settle my nerves. None of it touched the static building in my chest. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows on the drywall shifting with every passing car outside. The more I tried to close my eyes, the clearer the memories became. It started with the familiar sound, a low, metallic hum that did not belong in my quiet Colorado bedroom. In the dream, it was the engine of our lead vehicle in Syria, right before the second blast hit. I smelled dust. I felt the shove of air pushing against the armored door. Then came the sound I could never unhear: the scrape of twisted metal and the cry of the specialist trapped under the back panel. In the dream, I always heard him call my name, even though in real life he had been barely conscious. I dragged myself out of the sheets before the memory swallowed me whole. My hands were shaking. I sat on the edge of the bed with my elbows on my knees and waited for my breathing to slow. The digital clock blinked 1:17 a.m. I knew there was no point trying to sleep again. I turned on the small lamp by the dresser and pulled out my Class A uniform. The jacket hung perfectly pressed, the brass gleamed under the light. I slid one arm into the sleeve and then paused. My hands were trembling so hard that the fabric rustled. I tried again. The second sleeve fought me. When the jacket settled against my shoulders, it felt heavier than usual. Not physically, emotionally. A weight that came from knowing tomorrow would not simply be an evaluation. It would be a confrontation, a reckoning I had not asked for. I buttoned the jacket slowly. Each button felt like a test. My fingers slipped more than once. At one point, my hand shook badly enough that I had to stop and lean forward, forehead almost touching the mirror. I whispered to my reflection as if grounding myself could quiet the storm inside. "You survived worse. You can handle this." But the truth was, I did not know if I believed my own voice. My phone buzzed on the dresser. I hoped for a message from the friend who had supported me for months. Instead, I saw my mother's name. "Remember, no drama tomorrow. Do not embarrass us." The words glowed on the screen. They felt like a familiar slap delivered without hesitation. No drama. In her mind, trauma was drama. Pain was exaggeration. Symptoms were choices. My father had not messaged at all. Ethan sent a separate text that arrived minutes later. "Should be quick. Just answer what they ask and do not make it awkward." It was almost comical how little they understood about the process. Reintegration evaluation was not a short meeting or a questionnaire. It was a full review led by a medical board, the behavioral health officer, the company commander, and a JAG representative to ensure fairness. Sometimes even the battalion chaplain attended if emotional distress was expected. I mentally rehearsed the structure. First would come the medical board, a panel of clinicians who would review the physical and psychological findings from the last 6 months. They would ask about treatments, symptoms progress. Then, the behavioral health officer, Major White, would lead a segment focused on triggers, coping strategies, and readiness for continued duty. After that, the company commander would discuss performance conduct leadership evaluations and recommendations for future assignments. JAG oversight ensured everything remained within regulation and that no one, including family members, acted out of line. And finally, the chaplain would close with a short acknowledgement of service and sacrifice. The presence of the chaplain alone confirmed that this was not a small administrative event. It was a recognition of everything soldiers carried home, seen and unseen. My parents expected something closer to a school meeting. They had no idea they were walking into a structured review built to honor the very things they dismissed. The thought did not comfort me. It made me more anxious. I took off the jacket and placed it back on the hanger. I paced the apartment. Every creak of the floor sounded too loud. Every passing car made my shoulders tense. I tried to drink water, but my hands trembled around the glass. At 2:30 in the morning, I opened the blinds and stared out at the quiet rows of streetlights. The stillness made the loudness inside me feel even sharper. I remembered the moment that had started everything in Syria. The flash, the scream, the weight of the specialist as I dragged him across the dirt, his blood smeared across my gloves, his breath faint against my ear. The night air grew colder. I closed my eyes, but the memory stayed painted across the inside of my mind. The hardest part was not the memory itself, but the knowledge that my parents would never understand what that moment took from me. They would never understand what I carried home in silence. Instead, they would walk into that hall tomorrow believing they were the ones being inconvenienced, believing they were the ones whose opinion mattered. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a reminder email from the reintegration office. Family members must remain respectful throughout the ceremony. Any disruption will result in immediate removal by military police. I exhaled slowly. At least the Army knew how to maintain order. I watched the clock crawl toward dawn. At 6:15, I finally stopped pacing and sat on the edge of the bed. I had not slept at all, but exhaustion had a way of sharpening focus. Tomorrow would test me in ways combat never had. Tomorrow would bring every buried wound into the open. Tomorrow, I would stand in front of a room filled with people trained to see the truth behind symptoms, while my own family denied that truth entirely. I straightened my shoulders. I took one slow breath, then another. And in the quiet morning darkness, I made a silent promise to myself. Whatever happened in that hall, I would not let them define me again. The doors to the reintegration evaluation hall opened with a soft mechanical click, the kind that usually fades into background noise, but on that morning it sounded louder than my own heartbeat. The room was already filling with uniforms, polished shoes, rows of evaluators arranging papers, and the low, steady hum of quiet conversation. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows along the right wall, casting neat rectangles across the polished floor. Everything looked ordered and controlled, the opposite of the chaos I felt inside. I stepped forward, my Class A uniform fitting perfectly for once, though my shoulders fought to stay relaxed. A few soldiers from my battalion nodded politely as I passed. Several evaluators flipped through my file with unreadable expressions. I kept my gaze straight ahead, counting my breaths, one controlled inhale for every 4 steps toward the front rows. Then I saw them. My parents and Ethan sitting together as if waiting for a school assembly. My mother's posture was perfect. Her ankles crossed her blouse neatly pressed. My father lounged back in his seat with an air of indifference he had perfected over the years. Ethan scrolled on his phone, the light from the screen illuminating his bored expression. I walked to my assigned seat in the front row. My heels clicked once against the floor. Then I sat down, and the moment I did the sound I feared most arrived. My mother laughed. A small, sharp laugh like someone reacting to a private joke, except she did not bother keeping it private. She leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying far enough for those around us to hear. "This is going to be something." I felt my spine stiffen. Before I could breathe, my father followed, his voice low but perfectly audible to anyone within 3 seats. "PTSD. She is just soft." The words landed like stones dropped into a still pond, rippling outward. 3 soldiers in the row behind me turned their heads in unison. They looked stunned, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. One of them, barely 20 by the look of him, muttered quietly under his breath, "Did he just say that?" Another elbowed the first soldier lightly and whispered, "Dude, that is messed up." I kept my eyes forward, my jaw locked so tightly I could feel a pulse in my teeth. My hands rested on my knees, but they were growing colder by the second. It felt like every humiliation from childhood had marched into that room and taken the seats behind me. Major White, the behavioral health officer, stopped mid-motion while flipping through his clipboard. His hand froze above the page. He lifted his eyes, scanning the row where my parents sat. His brow tightened just enough for me to notice even from across the space. He did not say anything, but the pause spoke volumes. The room had not even begun the formal evaluation, and already my family had turned it into a spectacle. My chest tightened with a familiar pressure, the kind that arrives right before a flashback if I am not careful. I focused on grounding myself, feet flat on the floor, shoulder blades pressed against the back of the chair. Breathe slow, Avery. Do not give them the reaction they want. I thought perhaps the moment would pass quietly, that people would hear the comments, feel awkward, and look away, but instead, the room grew noticeably quieter. A ripple of silence spread from my row outward. Even the evaluators at the long table in the center paused their conversation. I did not dare look back to see who else had heard. Then, from the corner of my vision, another movement caught my eye. Colonel Marcus Hayes, sitting 3 rows behind my parents, angled slightly toward the center aisle. His presence had a gravity of its own. Decorated officer, years of service etched into the lines on his face. The kind of man whose silence alone carried authority. He was reviewing a file moments earlier, a thick binder with pages marked by colored tabs. But now he was no longer reading. He had heard everything. His head lifted, his jaw tensed, his eyes fixed sharply on my parents. Not the casual glance of someone overhearing something inappropriate. The focused stare of someone processing information with precision and intent. His gaze lingered on my father a fraction longer, as if measuring him. I felt my throat tighten, part fear, part shame, part something deeper, heavier, more painful. The kind of pain that comes from being exposed by the people who are supposed to protect you. My mother shifted in her seat, oblivious to the eyes now forming around her. She whispered again, louder this time. "She is always like this. Makes everything bigger than it is." I closed my eyes for a second. Just 1 second. Long enough to gather whatever strength I had left. When I opened them, I saw that Colonel Hayes was no longer in his seat. He stood slowly, not dramatically, but with a deliberate steadiness that drew attention whether he intended it or not. The evaluators took notice. Several soldiers straightened instinctively. His expression remained controlled, but there was something in his eyes, something sharp and cutting. A recognition, maybe. Or a warning. My father noticed him then, turning slightly with a casual glance, the kind he used when sizing up strangers at the grocery store. He had no idea who he was looking at. No idea what power or authority stood behind that uniform. No idea what was about to unfold. I felt myself shrinking and expanding, at once small because of my parents, larger because someone had finally seen behind their mask. My pulse hammered at my ribs. My palms grew damp. Every muscle in my body tensed, preparing for something I could not yet name. The ceremony had not even begun yet. The air felt charged, like the seconds before a storm hits. The humiliation was already public, and the people who heard it were not simply bystanders. They were soldiers, officers, evaluators, people trained to recognize the weight behind careless words. People who had witnessed trauma, lived through it, or spent their careers studying it. And standing among them was a JAG colonel who had just watched the entire scene unfold. There was no going back from that, and the day was only beginning. The sound cut through the room like a command detonator snapping open, a heavy folder slamming shut, sharp, final. It echoed against the high ceiling and bounced down the rows of chairs until every whisper, every rustle of paper, every breath was swallowed into silence. My body reacted before my mind caught up a trained instinct that made my shoulders square and my spine straighten. When I turned slightly, I saw the source of the noise. Colonel Marcus Hayes, 52 years old, decorated from 2 decades of service. Iraq in 24, Afghanistan in 29. A man who carried the quiet gravity of someone who had seen combat up close and understood the cost of it. He stood beside his chair with one hand still resting on the closed folder, the muscles in his forearm tightened under the fabric of his uniform. His eyes locked onto my parents with a focus that made the air in the room shift. Conversations died instantly. Soldiers who had been whispering sat up straighter. Even the evaluators at the central table paused with pens frozen above their paperwork. The colonel's voice arrived a moment later. Controlled, deep, weighted with authority that did not need to be announced. This soldier has seen more war than you will ever understand. The sentence carried through the hall without rising in volume. It did not have to rise. Every person heard it. Every person felt it. My mother blinked at him, startled for half a second before she recovered her usual defensive composure. She lifted her chin as if she were being asked to explain a minor misunderstanding. My father leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting into something halfway between annoyance and challenge. He clearly had no idea who he was dealing with. My mother let out a quiet scoff, a sharp puff of air that she disguised as a laugh. She whispered loudly enough for half the row to hear. "We are her parents. We know her better than anyone. She exaggerates, always has," as if she thought that would clarify things, as if she thought a decorated JAG colonel would hear her explanation and nod in agreement. My father added, "She just needs thicker skin." It was the same tone he used when telling me to toughen up as a child, as if pain were simply a personal flaw. The colonel's jaw tightened, a small movement, subtle, controlled, but it carried the weight of a man who had run out of patience for ignorance. He stepped into the aisle posture. Tall shoulders squared the polished insignia on his uniform, catching the sunlight. Silence deepened around him. The kind of silence where even air seems afraid to move. He looked at my parents the way an officer looks at a violation in plain sight. Not shocked, not emotional. Measured. Precise. A slow exhale left his chest before he spoke again. His tone shifted. He was no longer addressing two rude parents. He was addressing a breach of respect inside a military ceremony. "You do not get to come into this hall and belittle what you do not understand." My mother's eyes widened. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but the colonel cut her off before she could shape a single word. "Not here, not today. This is an evaluation of service and sacrifice. Not a stage for your mockery." Someone behind me whispered, "Oh my God," under their breath. A few soldiers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Major White lowered his clipboard entirely, now watching intently, his expression grim. My parents still clearly did not grasp the seriousness of the situation. My father shrugged dismissively. "We are only being honest. She needs to stop milking this." A wave of shock moved through the room. A medic sitting near the aisle shook his head slowly. A young private muttered, "Holy no," under his breath. The colonel's expression hardened. For a moment, it felt like the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. He took 2 slow steps toward my parents until he stood only a few feet away from them. His voice dropped lower, quieter, and somehow sharper than before. "She dragged a wounded soldier out of a burning vehicle in Syria. She has earned the right to speak about what she carries. You have not." My mother froze. Ethan finally looked up from his phone, confusion flickering across his face. My father shifted in his seat as if suddenly aware that this was not the kind of man you argued with. The colonel let the silence hold for a long, tense moment. Then his expression changed again. It became official, formal, the voice of a JAG officer enforcing protocol. "Military police." His call echoed through the hall. 2 MPs near the double doors straightened instantly and moved toward our row. "Escort these individuals to the hallway. They will not remain in this ceremony if they cannot maintain respect." The order struck the room like a lightning bolt. Public exposure. Moment number 1. My mother gasped as if the colonel had personally insulted her. She clutched her purse with theatrical indignation. My father sputtered, "What? This is ridiculous." "We are her family. We have a right to be here." The colonel did not raise his voice. He did not flinch. "You forfeited that right the moment you demeaned a soldier's combat injuries in a military facility." The MPs reached our row. They spoke calmly, professionally. "Sir, ma'am, you need to step outside. This way, please." My mother stood slowly, stunned. My father pushed himself up from the seat with a scowl, but even he did not challenge 2 uniformed MPs. Ethan muttered, "Are you kidding me?" as he followed them, phone still in his hand, as if the inconvenience mattered more than the humiliation. As they were escorted toward the doors, a wave of quiet disbelief followed them. Soldiers whispered, evaluators observed with sharp eyes, and I sat frozen in my chair, pulse thundering in my ears, face flushed with a mixture of shame, relief, disbelief, and something I had not expected. Validation. For the first time in my entire life, an authority figure had not just seen my parents for who they were. He had acted. He had done what no one in my family had ever done. He had stood up for me. The doors closed behind them with a soft but unmistakable thud, and the remainder of the room turned its full attention back to the ceremony, forever changed by what they had just witnessed. Long before the reintegration evaluation began, long before my parents mocked me in front of 60 people, and long before Colonel Hayes slammed that folder shut, something had already taken root in him. something that had nothing to do with me personally and everything to do with what he had seen in my file. Weeks before the ceremony, he had sat in his office, a small corner space in the JAG wing at Fort Carson with a tall window overlooking the motor pool. The desk was covered with case files, policy updates, and stacks of evaluations he was required to review every quarter. Most files passed through his hands without lingering. Standard forms, performance reports, deployment summaries. But when he opened mine, the room grew noticeably still. He read the first page, then the second. By the third page, his posture changed. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, expression tightening the way it does when someone recognizes something significant. The Syria deployment summary was detailed, more detailed than many he had seen that year. It described the convoy hit by a secondary device, the explosion that tore through the rear MRAP, the chaos that followed. It noted the smoke, the structural collapse inside the vehicle, the risk of further detonation. The report documented the injuries of the specialist trapped inside, but what caught the colonel's attention was the section describing my actions. Captain Dalton moved toward the damaged vehicle despite ongoing threat indicators. She initiated casualty extraction under compromised structural conditions. She maintained situational awareness under fire. She refused to retreat until the final soldier was clear. He paused after reading it. Most officers would have followed training, waited for additional support, or kept their distance until the scene stabilized. But stepping into a collapsing MRAP while ammunition cooked off nearby was not standard. It was instinct. And instinct like that came from somewhere deeper than training. He flipped to the next document, a 7-page commendation written by my squad leader. 7 pages, not the standard half-page summary. Not the quick bullet points supervisors often rushed through after deployments. 7 full pages. He read every word. He read about the smoke-choking visibility, the metal shifting under my hands, the soldier drifting in and out of consciousness. He read about how I pulled him free of the wreckage while another blast shook the ground. He read about how my uniform had partially melted at the sleeve from the heat and how I continued to drag the specialist until medics reached us. He read the part where my squad leader wrote, "She did not hesitate. If she had, we would have lost him." When he finished the letter, he sat back in his chair. He had seen men and women with similar stories, acts of instinctive heroism that rose above procedure. But there was something raw about this one, something that made him close the file and sit quietly for several seconds. He reopened it and scanned the attached behavioral notes. Returning soldier. Moderate PTSD symptoms, flashbacks, sleep disruption, hypervigilance. He knew those signs too well. He knew what they cost. He had lived through years of his own after his deployments. He knew the way trauma crawls home with you, the way it hides in the corners of ordinary life, the way it changes the way you move through the world. And he knew what it meant to carry those symptoms while still maintaining leadership, still training younger soldiers, still reporting for duty. He respected that. But the piece that sealed his reaction came last. A note tucked into the back of the file. A comment from a behavioral health provider. Soldier reports limited family support. She states her parents do not believe in mental health diagnoses. Soldier expressed concern about inviting them to reintegration ceremony. The colonel exhaled slowly when he read that line. He had heard that story too many times. Soldiers returning from war only to be dismissed by the people who were supposed to anchor them. In his experience, family disbelief carried a pain deeper than the wounds earned overseas. And when disbelief targeted psychological injuries, dismissing them as weakness or exaggeration, it created a destructive shame that endangered long-term recovery. He closed the file carefully, fingers pressing against the edges like someone holding something fragile. Then he set it aside and focused on other matters. But the details stayed in his mind. They stayed when he walked through the base. They stayed when he prepared for the evaluation. They stayed when he took his seat in the hall. So when he heard my mother laugh, when he heard my father say, "She is just soft," when he watched the smirk on Ethan's face, something inside him sharpened with immediate clarity. They were mocking the very act that had saved a soldier's life. They were trivializing the weight of the 7-page commendation he had read. They were reducing the severity of injuries he had personally seen cripple the strongest soldiers. And they were doing it in a room full of people who understood exactly what that kind of pain meant. It was not just disrespect, it was contamination, a poison infecting a space that was meant to honor service, not degrade it. The colonel had spent years protecting soldiers from predatory landlords, abusive spouses, broken systems, unfair dismissals, and bureaucratic errors. But what he could not tolerate was cruelty leveled against a soldier by their own family at the moment she needed grace most. So when he stood in that aisle and told them, "This soldier has seen more war than you will ever understand," he was not simply defending me. He was defending every soldier who had returned home to disbelief. Every soldier who had carried invisible scars that others refused to acknowledge. Every soldier who had been told to toughen up when they were already fighting to stay upright. The look he gave me after my parents were escorted out was brief. But in that short glance, I saw something I had not felt from any adult in a very long time. Not pity, not sympathy, respect. And that respect would anchor everything that came next. The hall settled into an uneasy quiet after my parents were escorted out, the kind of quiet that comes when everyone senses something important is about to unfold. The evaluators exchanged glances, recalibrating the tone of the entire ceremony. The company commander, Captain Ruiz, cleared his throat and stepped toward the podium. His voice carried a steadiness that filled the room with structure again. "We will begin the operational review. Please direct your attention to the front display." A large screen lowered from the ceiling with a soft hum. The lights dimmed, casting long shadows across polished uniforms. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I knew what was coming even before the first frame appeared. Syria. The convoy. The day everything changed. The footage began with the standard timestamp and GPS marker in the corner. The grainy view from a body camera shook lightly with the rhythm of movement inside the MRAP. Dust filled the air, blurring the horizon. The sound of radio chatter crackled through the speakers. Several soldiers in the room shifted in their seats, recognizing the tone. Then the blast hit. A violent jolt shook the screen. Tires screeched, voices shouted. The camera lurched sideways as debris scattered across the road. A few gasps rippled through the hall. The screen showed the burning rear vehicle flames rising along the left side, smoke curling thick into the air. The soldier wearing the body cam sprinted forward, breathing hard. The recording shook violently as he approached the wreckage. And then I appeared on the screen. I saw myself in grainy resolution, crouching near the collapsed side panel. My uniform was streaked with dust. My movements were sharp, urgent. I crawled under the hanging metal frame, reaching for the specialist trapped beneath it. The flames were close enough to distort the edges of the screen. Someone in the hall whispered softly, "Oh my God." The footage showed me hooking my arms under the wounded soldier's gear and dragging him backward inch by inch. Smoke billowed around us. My body cam in real life had later recorded my coughing. The footage shown now caught the echo of it. I kept pulling him until another soldier grabbed his shoulders and helped lift him toward the medics. When his feet cleared the danger zone, I stumbled forward, collapsing briefly on my hands and knees before pushing myself upright again. And then, the moment replayed in slow motion. My gloved hand tugging at the soldier's vest, the flames curling closer, the desperate drag across rough dirt, the final push towards safety. The room fell completely silent. Not a shuffle, not a cough, not a whisper. Even the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum more quietly. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Commander Ruiz let the footage play for a few more seconds before pausing it at the frame where I was kneeling on the ground, chest heaving, smoke swirling around me. He looked out at the room. "This is the soldier we are evaluating today." His voice did not rise, but the weight behind each syllable filled every corner of the hall. Several evaluators sat frozen with pens motionless above their papers. A few blinked hard, as if fighting unexpected emotion. A staff sergeant in the third row pressed his lips together tightly, his eyes reflecting the flames from the paused screen. A young private wiped at his face, quickly pretending it was just dust. My throat tightened. I had lived that moment. I had relived it hundreds of times in dreams, but seeing it this way through the eyes of others made the memory sharper, more real, and I felt again the fear and the heat and the determination that had carried me through it. From the corner of my eye, movement caught my attention. Through the glass window in the back doors of the hall, I saw my parents. They stood just outside, pressed close enough to the glass that their faces appeared pale and distorted by reflections. My mother's hand covered her mouth. My father's expression had collapsed into something unreadable, something stripped of arrogance. They were watching the same footage the entire room watched, but for the first time they were seeing it. The weight of what I had endured. The danger I had stepped into willingly. The life I had fought to save. And the painful truth they had mocked minutes earlier. The silence in the hall stretched so long I wondered if anyone would speak again. Then Colonel Hayes stepped forward. He took 2 slow steps, stopping where the light from the screen illuminated the front of his uniform. The room seemed to inhale collectively. He turned his head gaze, flicking toward the back doors where my parents still hovered behind the glass, pale and frozen. Then he looked at the evaluators, then at me, and finally his voice cut through the air. "This is the drama you laughed at." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. They landed with the weight of a verdict. A wave moved through the room, not sound but emotion, respect, anger, grief, solidarity. No one looked at my parents after that. They did not need to. Every person in the hall already understood the truth behind the footage, behind the commendation, behind the diagnosis, behind the scars no MRI could capture. The commander pressed a button and the screen faded to black. For several long seconds, the hall remained still. Then slowly, quietly, as if moved by something collective and unspoken, soldiers straightened in their seats. Evaluators lifted their pens with newfound certainty, and the reintegration evaluation continued with a clarity that changed everything. The second public exposure was complete, and there would be no going back. The hall stayed quiet for several long seconds after the screen went dark, as though every person present needed time to absorb what they had just witnessed. The evaluators glanced at one another, and something subtle shifted among them. Their expressions had changed. Their posture had changed. Their understanding had changed. And because of that, my future was about to change too. Captain Ruiz cleared his throat and addressed the board. "In accordance with regulation, we will now proceed with the readiness vote. Medical board, please submit your findings." The chief medical officer, a gray-haired lieutenant colonel with a calm manner, lifted a folder. "Based on our review of the soldiers' progress diagnoses, treatment compliance, and psychological evaluations, we find Captain Dalton fully fit for continued service with continued outpatient support, as recommended." A murmur of approval moved through the soldiers seated behind me. Then the behavioral health officer, Major White, stood next. His tone carried firmness, but also something gentler. "Captain Dalton displays symptoms consistent with combat exposure. These symptoms are being actively managed. She has demonstrated resilience, insight, and commitment to recovery. She remains mission capable." Another evaluator added, "We have no concerns regarding her leadership performance. All documentation supports her continued ability to serve at full capacity." One by one, they delivered their conclusions. Every voice aligned, every assessment affirmed. Then Commander Ruiz addressed the final portion of the vote. "All in favor of confirming Captain Avery Dalton's readiness to continue active duty, raise your hands." Every hand at the evaluation table lifted. Unanimous. A breath I had not realized I was holding escaped my chest. The commander offered a small but sincere nod. "Very well. Captain Dalton is cleared to continue her service." But he did not sit down. Instead, he lifted a second paper. "There is an additional recommendation from the battalion regarding recognition of extraordinary conduct during deployment." At first, I did not understand what he meant. Then he continued. "This soldier is recommended for the Army Commendation Medal for actions taken during the convoy incident in Syria." Dialogue broke quietly across the room. A few soldiers nodded. A couple of evaluators smiled softly. The battalion chaplain placed a hand over his chest briefly, as if moved by something he could not voice. I felt warmth spread through my lungs. Heavy. Real. It had been years since praise felt like anything other than an obligation from someone. Years since anything felt earned. Commander Ruiz folded the paper and looked directly at me with steady eyes. "Your service does not go unnoticed, Captain." His voice held no pity, only truth. Before I could respond, the back doors to the hall creaked open. My mother's voice floated in before any figure appeared. "This is absurd. We need to speak to someone in charge." My entire body tensed. MPs immediately stepped in front of the doorway, blocking the entrance with disciplined posture. I could not see my parents yet, but I heard the rising pitch of my mother's frustration. "Sir, we have a right to speak to the commander." My father's tone came next, sharp and irritated. "We need to correct some things you people misunderstood." One of the MPs responded calmly, his voice firm but courteous. "You will remain outside the hall. This is a controlled evaluation." My mother scoffed loudly. "We are her parents. We will not be pushed aside. We need to clarify that she exaggerates." Those words cut through the doorway like glass. Even with the doors nearly shut, her voice carried. Several soldiers turned their heads toward the back again. A few shook their heads in disbelief. One whispered, "Enough." Commander Ruiz stiffened but stayed focused. The MPs repeated, "Sir, ma'am, you are not authorized to enter." My father raised his voice, now frustration bubbling. "We need to tell him she dramatized her experience." The colonel's tone arrived again before the MPs even reacted, the same tone that had silenced the room earlier. "They are done here." The MPs straightened as if receiving a direct tactical order. "Yes, sir." They stepped further into the doorway, blocking the view completely. "Please, step back from the entrance." My mother protested, but the MP's posture remained unmoved. They did not argue. They did not explain. They simply enforced the order. And finally, the footsteps retreated down the hall. The door eased closed again. An uneasy hush fell over the room, but it was not the same hush as before. This one carried judgment, condemnation, and the knowledge that everyone present now understood who my parents truly were. It was at that moment, as the evaluators gathered their materials and prepared to move to the next phase, that I felt the shift inside myself. Not relief, not vindication. Something sharper, something steadier. Resolve. The first stage of justice had settled quietly around me. They had humiliated me for years. They had dismissed everything painful, everything difficult, everything defining. And for the first time, the consequences did not land on me. They landed on them, in the wrong hallway, in the wrong tone, to the wrong officer. They exposed themselves, and the military saw them clearly. When the meeting adjourned and soldiers rose from their seats, I stood slowly. The colonel passed by me with a nod, the kind that held respect, but also something else. A silent acknowledgement that the situation had not reached its end, only its beginning. The revenge arc had started, not with shouting, not with retaliation, but with truth. Their truth, revealed in front of the very institution that valued what they mocked. And in that moment, I understood something I had never allowed myself to admit. They could no longer hurt me privately, not after what happened today. The world had finally seen them, and now the consequences would follow. 1 week passed before the fallout found its way back to me. I had expected silence, maybe a tense email from my mother insisting she had been misunderstood, or perhaps a message from my father claiming the military had overreacted. Instead, they showed up in person. No warning, no appointment, no permission. I was leaving the behavioral health clinic on post when I heard my name shouted across the parking lot. Avery. The sound made my shoulders tense before I even turned. They stood near the visitor center entrance looking strangely out of place, as if the base itself rejected their presence. My mother clutched her purse with stiff fingers, while my father kept scanning the area nervously like he expected someone to approach them with a citation. I stopped several feet away. The distance was not accidental. "What are you doing here?" My mother stepped forward. Her smile was stretched thin, the kind she wore when trying to charm neighbors after yelling at them about fence height. "Honey, we need to talk. It's important." I didn't move. Talking never meant listening with them. It always meant correcting me or demanding something. My father cleared his throat. His voice was flatter than usual. "We've been dealing with some backlash. People are misunderstanding what happened last week." That one sentence said everything. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "we were wrong." Not, "we behaved terribly." No. The problem was that people noticed. My mother jumped in quickly before I could respond. The neighbors are being ridiculous. Someone saw that we were escorted out and now they're spreading things. One even said we disrespected the military. She looked wounded as she spoke. Not ashamed, not remorseful. Wounded, as if she were the true victim. My father added, "We need you to post a clarification. Just something short. A video or a statement saying everything was blown out of proportion." My jaw tightened. A clarification? That word felt almost surreal. They had embarrassed me in front of 60 people, mocked a diagnosis they never bothered to understand, and now they expected me to repair their reputation. My mother kept going. "Just tell people you misunderstood our tone. Say we never meant anything by it." A little laugh escaped her as if she were trying to make the situation sound harmless. You know how social media is. Things get twisted. That sentence snapped something clean inside me because it was the same excuse she had used my entire life whenever she crossed a line. We didn't mean it like that. I had heard it after insults, after dismissals, after minimizing tears. It was the family equivalent of wiping fingerprints off a glass and pretending nothing happened. I looked directly at her. "You didn't mean it like that." She nodded quickly, relieved that I had repeated her script. "Exactly. We love you. We would never try to hurt you." I inhaled slowly, letting the cold Colorado air settle in my chest before answering. "You can't hurt me and then ask me to clean your reputation." My mother's face froze. It wasn't shock. It was offense. Pure offense that I was not playing my assigned role. My father stepped forward, lowering his voice like he thought being quieter would make him sound reasonable. "Avery, you don't understand how this looks. People think we don't support you." I kept my gaze steady. "You don't." My father blinked rapidly. "That is not fair. Of course we support you. We just think you exaggerate certain things." I almost laughed, the same way you exaggerated my ceremony by calling it an embarrassment. My mother huffed. "Avery, don't twist this. We need your help. We're asking nicely." Nicely, as if there was a gentle way to demand that I lie on their behalf. I shook my head. "I'm not protecting you from the consequences of your own behavior." A long silence stretched between us. My mother's expression shifted from pleading to irritated. "Fine. If you won't help us, then at least talk to the commander. Tell him we were confused. Tell him we didn't mean to interrupt." I cut her off. "You interrupted to humiliate me. And you did it loudly, in front of people who actually know what PTSD means." My father exhaled sharply, frustrated. "This has gone far enough. You're being dramatic." Again. Dramatic! A word they weaponized more efficiently than any insult. Before I could form a reply, a voice came from behind me. "Captain Dalton, is everything all right here?" It was Sergeant Hill from the MP station near the gate. I had forgotten he usually monitored the visitor center during weekday shifts. My parents turned, instantly straightening as if caught doing something inappropriate. My mother lifted her chin. "We're her parents. We're having a private conversation." Hill gave a polite but unmoved nod. "Understood, ma'am, but you are not authorized to be unescorted beyond the gate without approval." My father snapped. "We're not doing anything wrong. We're just trying to clear up a misunderstanding." I stepped closer to Hill, keeping my voice calm. "They showed up without an appointment, and they'd like me to fix their public image." Hill's expression hardened just slightly, the kind of shift only someone trained in reading tone would recognize. "Copy that. Captain, do you want them escorted off post?" The question hung in the air. My mother's eyes widened. "Avery, you wouldn't." My father scoffed. "She's not serious. She knows we're her family." I thought of that word family. How many times they used it like an obligation or a leash. Not once had they used it like a shelter. I met Hill's eyes. "Yes, I want them escorted out." Hill gave a single nod. "Understood." 2 MPs approached from the side of the building. Professional. Silent. Efficient. My father raised his voice slightly. "This is ridiculous. We are her parents. We have a right to be here." Hill's tone stayed calm. "You do not have that right without authorization, sir. Please step back toward the gate." My mother looked at me one last time. Avery, please. This is humiliating. I did not soften. You created that, not me. They were guided toward the exit. No shouting, no argument, just consequences, exactly the kind they never believed could touch them. When the gate closed behind them, I exhaled fully. For the first time in my life, I felt something I had never felt in their presence. Control. They came to rewrite the story. Instead, they walked away, written into the truth. And this time, I was not the one cleaning the mess they made. The morning after the incident at the visitor center, I woke earlier than usual. Not from nightmares this time, but from clarity. It was the first morning in years where I felt like I was no longer bracing myself for their next intrusion, their next dismissal, their next twist of the truth. I sat at my small kitchen table on post, poured coffee, and laid out the documents I had gathered the night before. If my parents wanted a line crossed, they had chosen the wrong soldier. They had spent my entire life treating my boundaries like suggestions. Now the boundaries would come with paperwork signatures and enforcement. The first document was the easiest, a no-contact request through the base legal office. It was not emotional. It was procedural. I filled in every section with steady handwriting. The request stated that my parents had appeared on post without permission, disrupted a controlled environment the week before, and continued to cause distress linked directly to my clinical treatment plan. The JAG lieutenant reviewing the form read the statements twice, then looked at me. "You're well within your rights, Captain." I signed the final page. The second document required more detail. A formal notice to the installation that my parents were prohibited from entering any part of Fort Carson without pre-approval from command. When I submitted it, the clerk explained it would place their names on the access restriction list. If they attempted to enter again, MPs would stop them at the gate before they even reached the parking lot. Hearing that brought a quiet satisfaction. Not gloating, not pettiness, protection. Real protection for the first time. By midday, the restrictions were logged into the system. My parents had been kept out of my life through emotional exhaustion for years, but now they would be kept out with actual enforcement. The third step required me to leave post. I drove to their suburban neighborhood near Fountain, Colorado, a place that had always felt rehearsed. Lawns trimmed exactly the same height, mailboxes matching people waving with the kind of politeness that hides how much they judge behind closed doors. Their homeowners association was strict about everything from paint color to where you stored your trash cans. They were even more strict about reputation. I walked into the HOA office with a folder and a statement. The director looked up surprised to see a uniformed officer stepping inside. "Good morning, Captain. How can I help you?" I set the folder down. "I need to file an incident report regarding residents Robert and Linda Dalton." Her eyebrows lifted. "Your parents?" "Yes. There has been repeated misconduct connected to their behavior at a military event as well as harassment directed toward me on post." The director's expression tightened. "We take disturbances very seriously, especially those reflecting poorly on the community. I provided written documentation. They had disrupted an official reintegration evaluation ceremony. They had mocked a service-connected medical condition in a public space. They had attempted to force entry into a controlled building. All verifiable." The director exhaled sharply when she finished reading. "I appreciate you bringing this to us. Actions that reflect poorly on the neighborhood fall under our conduct clause. Consequences will be issued." I nodded. "Thank you." When I left the HOA office, I drove past my parents' house slowly enough to see the blinds move. Someone was watching. Maybe both of them. They chose not to walk outside. I didn't slow down. By the third day after the visitor center incident, I started hearing things from neighbors back near post. A coworker mentioned that someone in my parents' neighborhood had posted anonymously on a community page, asking why the Daltons had been escorted by MPs. Another person wrote underneath that they had heard the parents mocked a soldier's PTSD in an official setting. The thread grew. Even people who barely knew them chimed in, and by the time the HOA sent them the notification letter, neighbors were quietly distancing themselves. No more cheerful waves, no more small talk, just closed blinds and short responses. My parents valued appearances more than truth. Losing social approval was a punishment they never expected. And they had orchestrated it themselves. Justice rarely arrives loudly. Sometimes it arrives as isolation. My brother Ethan's downfall came separately. I had not planned anything for him. He had always played the golden child role too confidently to think consequences applied to him. But consequences do not need invitations. They simply arrive when truth becomes too loud to ignore. The call came from a mutual acquaintance who worked in the same corporate district as Ethan. "Hey, Avery, you might want to know something. Ethan got called into HR this morning. Apparently, someone found that old status he posted about veterans exaggerating trauma." I said nothing. "And apparently, someone on the board is a retired Marine." The acquaintance paused. It didn't go well. Within 2 hours, the update reached me. Ethan had been terminated for conduct that violated the company's values regarding respect for veterans and service members. He had built his identity on being charming enough to dodge accountability. But charm is powerless when screenshots exist. I sat on my couch reading the update twice. Not triumph, not glee. Something heavier. A reminder that justice does not always choose kindness. He had mocked me publicly for years. He had encouraged my parents' worst behavior. He had laughed at symptoms he never bothered to understand. Now he faced the same public judgment he helped create. It was not revenge. It was alignment. Consequences finding the correct targets. By the end of the week, my phone stayed silent. No calls from my parents. No messages from my brother. The world they built one where they dictated every narrative had cracked. And this time, I did not stand beneath the pieces. I stood outside watching the structure collapse under its own weight. Justice is not loud. It is steady. It moves one form at a time, one signature at a time, one truth at a time, until even the people who ignored reality can no longer outrun it. My parents wanted to control every detail of my life. My brother wanted to control the story. But the truth controlled the outcome. And for the first time in my life, the outcome belonged to me. I did not expect healing to feel unfamiliar, but it did. It felt almost uncomfortable at first, like wearing a new uniform that hadn't yet molded to my shoulders. For years, I had lived in a constant state of vigilance, bracing, waiting, managing myself around people who had never taken the time to understand me. When that weight lifted even slightly, I didn't know where to put my hands or how to sit still without waiting for the next emotional ambush. So I started with something simple. I kept every therapy appointment. I walked into the VA clinic twice a week. Not because someone ordered me to, not because I wanted a checkmark in my file, but because for the first time I wanted peace more than I wanted survival mode. My therapist, Dr. Jensen, was older, maybe in her late 50s, with a calm voice and the ability to let silence sit without feeling heavy. She didn't rush me. She didn't pry. She let my thoughts unfold at their own speed. One afternoon, she asked, "What does safety feel like to you?" I stared at the floor for a long time because I didn't have an answer. I had never stopped long enough to form one. It took several sessions before the words finally came. "Safety is when I don't have to defend my own reality." She nodded gently as if she already knew, and maybe she did. Therapy was not easy. There were nights after sessions when memories returned sharper than before. Times when sleep felt impossible because my mind replayed the convoy attack in loops. But the more I talked, the less those loops controlled the room. They lost their edges. They loosened their grip. Little by little, the nightmares broke apart. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like frost melting on a windshield. And somewhere in the middle of that process, I began reconnecting with the people who had lived beside me in those moments of danger. My old unit had a small unofficial chat group where we checked in on one another sporadically. I had muted it for months, afraid of being reminded of things I was trying to forget. But one night, I unmuted it. The first message that popped up was from Specialist Turner. "Hey, Dalton heard about the ceremony. Proud of you. Short, simple, real." Then another message came from Staff Sergeant Jimenez. "You saved my life in Syria. Don't forget that." I stared at that message for several minutes. In all the chaos of my parents' betrayal, I had forgotten that others had witnessed different parts of my life, parts my family never cared to understand. I typed back slowly. "Thank you. I'm working on things." Jimenez responded, "Right here if you need anything." And he meant it. A few weeks later, the battalion hosted a casual barbecue for returning soldiers and their families. I almost skipped it. Crowds still made my pulse spike sometimes, but when I arrived, several soldiers approached immediately. Not with pity, with respect. A private I barely remembered from the Syria rotation walked up nervously. "Ma'am, is it true you pulled Sergeant Rhodes out of the MRAP?" I nodded quietly. He shook his head in disbelief. "That's the story they tell all the new guys." That was the moment I understood something had shifted in how people saw me. My parents had tried to reduce me to someone fragile, someone dramatic, but here on base I was something else. Someone steady, someone who endured, someone who kept going even when it hurt. That realization hit even harder when Colonel Hayes approached me during the event. He carried himself with the same calm authority as always, but there was warmth beneath it now. "Captain Dalton, do you have a moment?" I stood at attention instinctively. "Yes, sir." He folded his hands behind his back. "Veterans Day is next month. We are organizing the ceremony and I would like you to speak." My stomach tightened. "Sir, there are other officers with more experience." He shook his head once. "The soldiers in this battalion need to hear from someone who understands what the return home actually feels like. Someone honest. Someone who does not hide truth to make others comfortable." He paused long enough for the weight of his words to settle. "And quite frankly, Captain, you represent resilience in a way few do." Something tight in my chest loosened. No one had ever used that word for me. Resilience. I had been called stubborn, emotional, dramatic, difficult, anything but that. I swallowed hard. "If you want me to speak, sir, I will." His nod carried respect. "Thank you, Captain." When he walked away, I felt something rare. Pride without fear of being punished for it. Veterans Day arrived on a crisp morning. Flags lined the parade field and families filled the seating. I stood behind the podium, my hands steady. When I began speaking, the words came easier than I expected. I spoke about service, about returning home, about invisible wounds. But most importantly, I spoke about finding strength in places that were never safe before. When I finished, the applause was long, not dramatic, not theatrical, just full. As I stepped back from the podium, several young soldiers approached. One said quietly, "Ma'am, thank you. I needed to hear that." Another added, "My family doesn't understand either." Hearing that helped. In that moment, I understood why Colonel Hayes had chosen me. Not because of medals, not because of rank, but because I had survived something beyond deployment. I had survived the people who were supposed to love me. I had grown past them. I had chosen healing where they chose denial. By the end of the day, something settled inside me fully. I was no longer defined by the wounds my family ignored. I was defined by the strength I rebuilt myself. And without trying, without even noticing, I had become something within my unit that my parents could never erase. A symbol of resilience. A reminder that healing is not quiet weakness. It is the loudest victory. Promotion ceremonies always carried a certain formality, a rhythm passed through generations of soldiers long before I ever put on a uniform. But the morning of mine felt different. The air on the parade field was crisp and still, the kind that made flags snap sharply against their poles. Rows of soldiers filled the seats, dress uniforms, immaculate boots, shined, faces focused. I stood at the front beside the stage, hands clasped behind my back. My Class A uniform pressed so perfectly it almost didn't feel like my own. Yet under the fabric, my heartbeat was steady. It had been steady for weeks now. Healing did that. Truth did that. Justice did that. Most of all, the absence of the people who tried to shrink my life into something small did that. The seating area behind the soldiers was open to approved guests, neat rows reserved for family members and close friends. 2 seats in the very front row remained empty. Not reserved. Not saved. Simply empty. They were where my parents would have sat if they had been invited. But they were not. They had forfeited that right the moment they laughed at my wounds in front of strangers. So the chairs sat untouched under the sun. Reminders not of absence, but of boundaries finally enforced. Colonel Hayes stepped to the podium. His presence commanded attention effortlessly. Ladies and gentlemen, today we recognize a soldier whose record speaks for itself, but whose resilience speaks even louder. His gaze swept the crowd, then settled briefly on me. Captain Avery Dalton has served with honor, courage, and unwavering dedication through 2 deployments and the challenges that followed. She represents what it means to endure with integrity. A murmur of approval moved through the formation. Hayes lifted a small velvet box from the podium. This award was recommended unanimously by her chain of command following her actions in Syria. The Army Commendation Medal is presented for acts of heroism or meritorious service. In her case, both apply. He motioned for me to step forward. My boots felt grounded with every step as I stood in front of him facing the field. He opened the box, revealing the medal. The sunlight caught the edge of the medal, making it flare briefly like a spark. Colonel Hayes pinned it carefully to my uniform, his hands steady. When he stepped back, he held my gaze for a full second. "Well earned, Captain." Pride swelled in my chest, but not the fragile kind that shatters when challenged. This pride felt built on the foundation of everything I had fought through, not just on deployment, but at home. Hayes returned to the microphone. "And now it is my privilege to confirm Captain Dalton's promotion." The word promotion echoed across the field. "Officially, Captain Dalton has been recognized previously, but today marks the ceremonial confirmation of her rank." He gestured for me to return to my place center stage. A senior NCO stepped forward with the certificate. As Hayes handed it to me, his voice carried across the still air. "Captain Dalton exemplifies courage not only in combat, but in the face of adversity where many fall silent. She stands as proof that integrity is stronger than mockery and resilience speaks louder than cruelty." The applause started immediately. It wasn't polite or half-hearted. It was full, real. A wave of hands clapping from the front rows to the far back of the formation. Soldiers who had served with me nodded firmly. New soldiers studied me with a mixture of respect and hope. A few families in the back stood up. The noise rose and rose, and behind all of it, those 2 empty chairs stayed exactly where they were, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. This is who belongs and who does not. After the ceremony, several soldiers came to shake my hand. One young private said softly, "Ma'am, that was powerful." Another added, "My parents don't understand either. Seeing you up there made me feel less alone." Their words meant more than any medal ever could. When the crowd thinned, Colonel Hayes walked to me with a small but meaningful smile. "You carried yourself well today, Captain." I nodded. "Thank you, sir." He looked toward the empty chairs, then back to me. "You chose peace over approval. Not many people are strong enough to do that." His words landed quietly but deeply. It was not until the ceremony ended and I was alone on the field that I let myself breathe fully. The medal weighed gently against my uniform, just enough to remind me that everything had changed. Not because of validation, not because of recognition, but because I had built a life that no longer depended on people who spent years diminishing me. I glanced once at the empty chairs again, not with sadness, but with certainty. Some absences are not losses. They are boundaries, and boundaries are victories. As I left the field, I whispered the truth I had earned through every step of this journey. Family is the people who stand with you, not the ones who laugh when you're hurting. Later that evening, when I opened my laptop to thank the unit for the support, I paused before typing. This story was not just mine. It belonged to anyone who had ever been dismissed by the people they trusted the most. It belonged to anyone who had clawed their way back to peace. So I ended my message with a question, one that mattered more now than ever. Would you forgive them or keep your boundaries like I did? Comment below. I read every single one.